We had a great event yesterday with Randall Jones from the OECD. He talked about the OECD's recent survey of Korea's economy, and income inequality was one of the sections in their report. Today, we are looking more closely at income inequality specifically. This has been a topic that the candidates for the president of Korea had to address during their campaigns. Now we have the Park Geun-hye administration and the Bank of Korea governor and others having talked about the importance of addressing income inequality. Moreover, income inequality is not just an issue impacting Korea, but the United States and other countries as well. This is why we are glad to have Dr. Yiagadeesen Samy from Carleton University to talk with us today about some of the economic theories behind income inequality and some of the economic trends we see in Korea that may be affecting income inequality. Dr. Yiagadeesen Samy is an associate professor and the associate director of the MA program at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Dr. Samy is also a distinguished research associate at the North-South Institute. He has a BA in economics and mathematics from York University, a MA in economics from the University of Toronto, and a PhD in economics from the University of Ottawa. He has written a great paper for us, and he has done previous work looking at income inequality in other countries like Brazil. He is an excellent person to help give us some insight and further our discussion about income inequality in South Korea. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yiagadeesen Samy.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas, for this generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to also thank the Korea Economic Institute for supporting this research. It's a pleasure to be here. What I want to do is talk about the evolution of income inequality in South Korea, with deindustrialization being a core part of this, and I'll explain what I mean by this in a few minutes. There's a couple of things that I wanted to highlight at the beginning. One is this paper is part of a broader research program where we are actually trying to make sense of inequality patterns around the world. So as Nicholas pointed out earlier, we've looked at Brazil as a case. We've highlighted a few other countries where inequality has been going in different directions, and the point of this is to try to make sense of all of it. The other thing I'd like to point out is that I'm not an expert on South Korea. So I came across South Korea as many of the students of trade and development do in their courses, because South Korea is often cited as a very interesting economic model for development, and also because it's a country that successfully liberalized export-oriented industrialization. But what is interesting with South Korea is the amazing structural transformation that has taken place in the last 4 or 5 decades. So I think it's a very interesting case to look at. And you'll understand in a few minutes why I think it is. Because I think the structural changes have taken place fairly quickly over a relatively short period of time. And maybe not being an expert on South Korea is actually a good thing, because I'm an outsider looking in, trying to make sense of data. And so I don't come into this with any sort of bias, and I'd welcome suggestions and comments that you have, because this is very much a work in progress. And some of you in the room may probably have more knowledge of South Korea than I do. So this is briefly what I want to do. So I want to introduce why this is important, broadly speaking, but also in the South Korean context. I will very briefly go over the literature on growth and inequality with a particular focus on empirical studies, because I think a lot of the empirical work that's been done has been it's been very difficult to find conclusive evidence in that literature. So there's no clear understanding of how growth and inequality move together. There's theories, there's been lots of papers written, but I think the evidence is a bit all over the place. So I think that's something to keep in mind. I will then present a very, a theoretical framework that basically extends a model if you will, proposed by Simon Kuznets many years ago. It was a seminal contribution. It's still a contribution that is widely cited in the literature. What I'll do when I present the theoretical framework is show you how I basically just extended it by adding by putting an additional dimension to it. And that's basically the framework that I use. And then I estimate that model using data, and I'll present the results. And finally, I'll conclude with some policy implications and maybe directions for future research as well, because I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be looked into further based on this paper. So, income inequality. Sorry, let me go back. Okay, so I think it would not be. I think it's fair to say that income inequality is now back on the agenda. Since 2000, when countries signed on the Millennium Declaration, there's been a lot of talk about growth, poverty reduction. Inequality was not really present at the time, but I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a lot of interest regarding income inequality. I don't know how many of you have heard about Thomas Piketty, a French economist, whose book now has made the bestseller list. It is really about income inequality, and much of his focus is actually on the top 1% income earners. It's an amazing book. It's a big book that I would encourage people to read if you have a chance. It's received a lot of very good reviews by well-known economists such as Paul Krugman. The Occupy Wall Street movement is another clear indication of this. Of these concerns about income inequality. And the post-2015 development agenda, which is also being discussed now, is very likely to include income inequality as one of the objectives. We don't know yet what kind of form or indicators will be used, but clearly income inequality is now in that discussion. There's been a lot of talks in the last few years about inclusive growth. The World Bank, for example, now has decided to focus on the bottom 2 quintiles, so the bottom 40% of the population of countries, to look at how these groups are doing. So they are more and more focusing on people at the bottom of a distribution as well. So, there's lots of things that are going on now that indicate that income inequality, if it was not on the agenda before, is clearly back on the agenda. So as I said, the bank has clearly stated that it's now going to focus on improving growth of the poorest 40% in each country. The other interesting finding about income inequality, if you look at the data, is the fact that it's moved in different directions around the world. So most OECD countries, Canada, the US, South Korea, have seen increases in income inequality in the last few years, if you look at the Gini coefficients. Latin America, which traditionally has had the most unequal countries in the world, is now going through a period of declining income inequality. And there are many explanations as to why this is the case. Part of it has been attributed to massive redistribution policies, such as conditional cash transfers. And there are studies also that attribute this decline in inequality to the expansion of education. So it is interesting to look at these two, the OECD countries on the one hand and Latin American countries on the other, because they are going through very different experiences with regards to inequality. And then we have the two largest economies in the world, China and India, who are also seeing increases in inequality of income in the last few years. So how do we make sense of all of this? And what I'm going to do in this paper is actually use South Korea as the case study. And I'm going to look at a fairly long period of time, going back to 1965 up until now. This is the longest period for which we have data that we can use. And I'm going to try and make sense of all of this. Now, the South Korean case is very interesting, partly because there's, as Mr. Hamisevich mentioned in his introduction, there's been a lot of talk in South Korea in the last few years about income inequality in news outlets, policymakers. the governor of a central bank, even the president, the current president of South Korea mentioned, rebuilding the middle class in her last presidential campaign. So it is something that is part of a conversation. What is actually interesting from my perspective on this is that if you look at the numbers, South Korea is by no means a highly unequal country if you compare it to, let's say, the US or even Latin American countries. But what people are concerned about is the fact that even though it's not as highly unequal as many other places, inequality has been increasing. So South Korea went through a long period during which inequality declined, and now it's going back up. So if you look at the Gini coefficient for 2011, South Korea is at about 0.32, the US is at 0.37, Brazil, which is another case that we've looked at, is at 0.46. Canada is very close to South Korea at 0.31. We don't have data for China and India for that year, but in 2009, China was about 0.47, India was about 0.5. So South Korea is by no means a highly unequal country when it comes to income distribution. But again, as I mentioned before, the concern here is the fact that it is increasing. So it's not necessarily looking at an absolute number, but looking at the pattern of inequality that is raising alarm bells, if you will. So for that reason, I think it's interesting to look at it. The other reason why I think it's also interesting to look at it is partly because it's a country that has had very impressive growth numbers. If you average it out over a very long period of time, you get almost 7% growth, which is very rare. You don't see that a lot. GDP per capita, as a result, went from about 1/10 of that of the US to about half of the US over that same period of time. In fact, I looked at the numbers. I think South Korea had only 2 years of negative growth in that whole period. One in 1980, one in 1998 after the Asian financial crisis. Right now, growth has stabilized at around 4%, and people are worried about this. But even 4% growth is actually quite good in the current context. So that just gives you a sense of how highly performing the South Korean economy has been. But the reason I mention this is partly because we know a lot about the growth story of South Korea. But comparatively speaking, we don't know very much about the inequality story in South Korea. And I hope that this paper will at least start a conversation or contribute to what's out there about inequality. And on the issue of inequality, my reading of the literature after having scanned and read many, many papers on the South Korean case is that although many reasons have been mentioned in the literature, the results are clearly not robust. So some papers find that, for example, trade matters, or foreign direct investment matters, or does not. Others find that it's completely the other way. So there's really no clear explanation for why we see inequality moving the way it's moving in the South Korean context. So I'm fairly convinced that there's a lot of work that should and needs to be done in the South Korean case. So basically, what this paper does in terms of contribution is, one, it extends the seminal contribution by Kuznets. In particular, what I do in the paper is to estimate an extended Kuznets model, because the argument that I make in the paper is that we don't have one but two turning points. And I'm using data from the standard world income inequality database. I will talk about it in a few minutes very quickly. And basically what I do is extend the model by Kuznets, because Kuznets in 1955 talks about an inverted U hypothesis where you have one turning point. What I'm essentially arguing in this paper is that you can get two of them. And the reason you get two is because you need to capture two transitions, one from agriculture to industry, the second one from industry to services. And South Korea is a very interesting case, again, because it has gone through these two transitions. And what I argue in terms of contributing to the explanation is that structural changes play a key role in this framework. And industrialization and deindustrialization are actually what's driving that change. So that's the Kuznets hypothesis. Some of you will have seen this before, probably. It's the textbook it's a textbook explanation of how inequality moves that most students of development actually study in their courses. Kuznets argued that as a country develops, inequality initially goes up, and then it declines after a turning point has been reached. Now, in fairness to Kuznets, given that he was writing in the mid-1950s, he probably could not have anticipated that a lot of economies would have very strong service sectors at the time. Keep in mind that, 50 years ago, the emphasis was 50, 60 years ago, the emphasis was really on industrialization. That's how people used to think about development typically. So he could not have seen the other turning point. So that's how you end up with this model. And basically the argument there is that initially capital and human capital tend to be very heavily concentrated among a few people. Over time, capital accumulation and diffusion leads to a decline of inequality as more and more people participate. So really what Kuznets has in mind is a shift of population from the agricultural sector to the industrial sector. Or sometimes in textbook models of this, people think about the rural versus the urban sector. So that's how you get this inequality, so this relationship between income and inequality. Now, this model has been discredited many, many times by empirical studies. There are theoretical explanations for the model that have been placed forward. Most of them focus on the kinds of structural changes that I mentioned before, namely the shift of population. But empirical studies have not yielded very satisfactory results. So you have a lot of studies that find evidence of this inverted U hypothesis, and then you have studies that find that it's non-existent. And you also have studies that find that it's not an inverted U, but a U, like a straight U relationship. Part of the problem with this is the fact that many of these studies did not really test what Kuznets had in mind. And I think this is really one key aspect of what I'm trying to do here, is to look at a particular country over time. Because the Kuznets paper is really about looking at inequality in countries over time and looking at its evolution. But when people started testing this relationship, they didn't have time series data. Instead, they had a cross-section of countries that they would put together. And the problem there is that many Latin American countries just happened to be in the middle. They had the highest income inequalities and had the middle and were middle-income countries, which meant that the relationship that people were finding may not necessarily have been what Kuznets had in mind, but rather related to the characteristics of these countries themselves. Over time, when time series data became available and people tested it again, the relationship completely disappeared, partly because people were able to control for these country characteristics. So these empirical studies have, in a sense, been very controversial. And what I'm trying to make a case for in the current paper is that we are actually better off estimating that relationship and looking at it for one country at a time, because there we can really see how things evolve over time. So I think that's really interesting in terms of looking at a particular case, and we've looked at Brazil before, now we're looking at South Korea. There's a quote by Ravi Kanbur, who did a lot of work on income inequality and examining the Kuznets hypothesis, and I think he gets it very right. Ravi Kanbur is a great economist. He does a lot of work on inequality and a lot of other issues, but I think his quote about this is really pertinent, because what he's essentially saying is that in many cases, researchers tend to be stuck in this sort of framework where you're trying to look at inverted U patterns in the data, and his view is that we need to start thinking broadly, more broadly about this issue. So basically what I do then is estimate a relationship that captures both. So if you look at the Kuznets relationship in its original version, what you would have, the original version of a relationship would have looked only at a square function. So it would have captured only the first two because it's a quadratic relationship. What I'm trying to make a case for in this paper is that if you estimate a polynomial of order 3, you would actually get the two turning points in the data. And by estimating it in this way, we can anticipate what the signs will be to fit the story that I'm trying to tell, namely that the first beta should be positive, the second one should be negative, and the third one should be positive. And if it is the case then we will get this sort of cyclical movement in the data. So the dependent variable in this case is inequality. I'm using a Gini coefficient, and then I'm controlling for income levels in log form. So this is fairly standard in the literature. This is the typical formulation, but the contribution that I'm making here is that I'm adding this additional term to estimate it. And then later on, I will add other things to the model to verify whether the hypothesis still holds, because I want to make sure that whatever I'm estimating is not spurious. So am I getting the right result? And are these results also robust to additional variables? And by estimating an equation with a cubic function, I'm essentially capturing the two turning points in the data. And the hypothesis that we're proposing here is that you will see both. So you will see the cyclical movement. The Kuznets relationship will hold as long as growth and industrialization are positively correlated. So as a country industrializes, and this is the old Kuznets story, inequality first goes up and then it declines. But over time, when deindustrialization starts taking place and the economy moves more and more towards the service sector, that relationship actually flips over. So the inverted U becomes a U. Initially, inequality continues to decline, and then it picks up again over time after you reach a minimum point. Now, how do I come up with this hypothesis? It's by looking at a previous case, and this is really where the intuition for the current paper comes from. It's because we looked, with another colleague of mine, we looked at the Brazilian case, and what we discovered is the existence of these flips in the Kuznets relationship. So in the Brazil paper that we wrote a couple of years ago and that was published last year, we were able to actually use census data. So this is a very large data set that covers more than 5,000 municipalities, and we have two different periods of time, 1991 and then 2000. And basically what we find is that, if you were to look at national level data in the case of Brazil, you would probably find something that looks very much like a Kuznets story, an inverted U. But when you use census data at two different points in time, you see a completely different picture. And in the case of Brazil, what we propose in that paper and that we argue in the paper is that this is in part due to deindustrialization. And in the Brazilian case, the shock is a lot more brutal than in the South Korean case, because they went through massive liberalization in the 1990s. Industrial value added fell by almost half. And what you end up in Brazil is a picture that looks like this. I don't know if you can see this, but basically what we have is one standard Kuznets explanation, which is for 1991. So inequality is increasing and then declining. And then in 2000, inequality is declining and then goes back up again. And basically what we are able to do in this is to track where these municipalities are moving. So initially you had about 30% of municipalities in Brazil on a declining path of inequality. 10 years later, almost 98% of them are now on a declining path. And then there's a few who are on an increasing path. So basically what this tells us is that this relationship that Kuznets had proposed many years ago is not given. In fact, it's conditional on whether a country is industrializing or not. And this is really where the intuition for the current paper comes from. It's by examining this data for the Brazilian case. And again, as I pointed out, in the Brazilian case, had we not looked at the data in this way, we would not have seen it, right? If you looked at national level data, you would never see this relationship. So building on this, what we do then is estimate the relationship that I proposed earlier. The data on income inequality comes from a data set that's been put together by Frederick Salt. It's a very interesting data set because it's able to maximize comparability across countries and over time. And part of a problem in the past is that inequality data sets were not very good, in the sense that we didn't have a lot of coverage, and we were using very different measures, and in many cases you cannot go back far enough in time. So this one gives us enough data points at the national level to be able to estimate the model. Other variables that we use are from the World Development Indicators database. And basically, what we do is run several regressions. What I've highlighted in what's shaded on this table is essentially to show you that the relationship that we hypothesize is really robust. So the betas are positive, negative, and positive. They are all significant at the 1% level. If you go from column 1 to column 2, you can see that the extended Kuznets model does better than the original one because it has a higher explanatory power and it's highly significant. And then what the paper does in the rest of the columns 3, 4, and 5 is that we add other variables in the literature to verify whether the main hypothesis holds. And it turns out that they do, that this relationship still remains very significant. Now, there's a lot of background work that went behind this because this is time series data. So we have to make sure that it's stationary, that we're not getting spurious results. So we use a number of tests that I've outlined in the paper. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but it's standard procedure for how you would handle time series data. So that's very standard in the literature. And what we end up doing is using first differences in order to make sure that the data is stationary and that the results are not misleading. So that's basically what we end up with. As I said, I've outlined in the actual paper how I go about this in a fair bit of detail. And if you have questions later on, I'll be happy to answer them. We test whether other variables such as trade, FDI, and globalization matter. Turns out actually that they don't contribute that much except for FDI. Now, it doesn't mean, and I think that's one of the things that I try to make clear in the paper, is that it doesn't mean that these variables are not important. They probably played a role, but the point that we are trying to make is that even when you include them, the structural characteristics can still explain a lot. So if you look at column 2, just focusing on these structural characteristics, you're able to explain about 45% of a variation in income inequality. So that's quite a lot for the model. So just to summarize, these estimated betas are significant with the right signs. The estimated equation has a better fit than the standard one, and these results are robust to inclusion of various variables. And the visual is basically this. So that's what we hypothesized. And this is the estimated relationship. So we've fitted the cubic function to the data for South Korea. And if you had written this paper 15 years ago, you would probably have said that Kuznets was right. Because you would not, so your analysis would stop somewhere here. This would not exist. So you would say, well, this is the standard Kuznets story. Income inequality went up and down. But now if you write the paper, which is what we just did, you see that inequality is going back up again. Right? So you have a more cyclical relationship based on the estimations that we did. And the explanation that we've hypothesized is coming from structural characteristics. So if you look at the structural characteristics for the South Korean economy, there's basically two ways in which you can look at this. One would be to look at value added of each sector over time. So it is very clear in the first graph that the value added of agriculture has declined. Industry, it went up significantly until the 1990s, and then in the 1990s it starts to decline after reaching a peak, and it's sort of plateaued in the last few years. So it hasn't really declined more, but its relative share compared to the service sector is certainly smaller, because if you look at the service sector value added, It's clearly increasing over time, right? The other way to look at this, industrialization and deindustrialization, is to look at sectoral employment shares in South Korea. Now, in this case, we don't have data that goes back to the 1960s, but even looking at it since the 1980s, you can still see a clear pattern that mimics basically what you see in the first graph. So you have the service sector employing a significantly higher proportion of people. Agriculture is declining. Industry goes up until the 1990s, reaches a peak, and then starts to decline. And so this explains essentially what I'm trying to get across, which is this pattern of industrialization and deindustrialization is what explains why inequality goes through a cyclical, goes up, down, and then goes back up in this cyclical way. Basically, what it's saying is that this relationship is not given. It's conditional on whether industrialization or deindustrialization is taking place. Now, I want to be careful about this because, I'm not in any way saying that the manufacturing sector is not strong in the South Korean case. It is still a major contributor, but its relative share in GDP is declining. And you can see it from the data that the service sector is becoming larger and larger. But having said that, the manufacturing sector is still fairly strong. And so it's that relative importance that is really the key. And I think it's possible to make sense of this by looking at premium to skills. Because if you go back to the original Kuznets story, what Kuznets was essentially arguing is that increasing returns to education lead to increasing inequality, and then when returns to education decline, inequality declines. And that's what you see for the first part, right? So industrialization takes place, some people get educated, it increases inequality because the returns to education go up. Over time, as educational supply is expanded, there are more and more people who are educated. That leads to a compression of a skill premium. And that's been documented elsewhere, right? So the skill premium declines for a while. When deindustrialization takes place, it's the demand that is affected because now you don't need as many skilled people as you needed before. So when the demand for skilled labor is declining, the returns to education also declines, continuing the downward trend in inequality. And then as more and more people move to the service sector, inequality goes back up again because essentially in the service sector, the wages are more dispersed because in the service sector, you have a huge range in terms of wages. So as an economy moves more and more towards the service sector, you're likely to see the wage distribution becoming larger. Whereas when a country is heavily industrialized, you have guaranteed wages by the majority of the people, and the dispersion of that wage is actually tends to be narrower. So that is how you can probably explain what's going on behind industrialization and deindustrialization, is by making that link to what happens to the premium over returns to what we call the skills premium over returns to education as a country goes through different phases of industrialization and deindustrialization. So that's essentially what gives that Kuznets relationship its shape. So just to summarize and conclude with some implications, I hope I've been able to convince you that we can understand the evolution of inequality in the South Korean case, and maybe in other cases, and that remains to be seen, but at least in the South Korean case, the extension of the Kuznets model seems to provide a fairly compelling story of what's happened over the last 40, 50 years. And in particular, the transition from agriculture to manufacturing and then manufacturing to service. So what this would point out is that managing these structural pressures seem to be a key going forward. Now, if you follow what I said before, and if you look at the estimated relationship, it would seem that South Korea is now on a path of increasing inequality because of the structural changes. And the question is, how do you deal with it, right? And this is where policy matters, or maybe policy should matter. So, of course, people have talked a lot about redistribution, but I think in the South Korean case, it's going to be particularly challenging. In fact, I went and looked at data on taxation and social spending. It's probably one of the lowest in the OECD when you compare to other places. And of course, what I'm saying here has implications also for how the service sector adapts and evolves over time. Because one of the things that comes out of the literature on the service sector in South Korea is the fact that it's less productive than the manufacturing sector. And I think what I'm saying here probably has implications for how you can ensure that the service sector becomes more dynamic and productive over time. So that's basically what the paper is in a nutshell. I think I've covered pretty much what I wanted to do, and I'll leave it open for discussion now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samy, for your presentation. So now we'll open it up to you for questions. We have a couple microphones, so if you just do state your name and ask us a question. You can go right over here to start.
Hey, Russell Lester, the private contractor. We had a presentation yesterday, a recent presentation that covered FDI. I believe, so I get the whole story, but FDI is relatively low in South Korea. And you mentioned FDI as a factor you looked at, factoring in inequality. What sort of policy ramifications or suggestions do you think changing South Korean policy towards welcoming FDI might affect inequality?
If you look at the table of results in the paper, you will see that FDI is actually significant. And it shows up with a positive number, which would, if you believe what the estimates are saying, it's that investment in South Korea has actually increased income inequality. Now, my reading of the literature on this is that this relationship is not very strong, because ultimately what matters is not FDI per se, but where it is going. So for example, if FDI is going in a sector that is highly skilled, then it's going to improve earnings for skilled workers, and relatively speaking, it's going to enlarge that gap. But if it goes in relatively low-skilled sectors, then it's going to have a reverse impact. And people who've actually studied FDI explicitly in the South Korean case have also come up with very contradictory findings. So I think ultimately, if you want to get to the bottom of this, you really need to look at where FDI is going and the kinds of sectors that it's affecting. For me, the objective of this current paper was really not to think too much about this, but rather to see whether it would affect the main hypothesis of my paper. But it doesn't mean that it's not important. It's certainly something that, people should look into. But for me, the point is not to say that FDI is clearly what most countries want, and there's no question about it. But to look at the implications for inequality is something else.
Yeah, another question right here, please.
David Livingston from the Carnegie Endowment. I'm going to ask a sort of similar question, but the topic this time being automation in the economy, and particularly I'd be interested in your thoughts of how we should think about automation. Is clearly something that goes on in an industrialization phase. Automation is also increasingly something that's going on in a deindustrialization or post-industrialization service sector economy phase. Thinking through your conceptual framework of elaborating the Kuznets curve, how should we think about automation, robotics, et cetera, as driving inequality or as interacting with inequality generally?
Actually thought about this quite a bit, and I think the difference that I see is that the service sector is perhaps less I mean, within the framework that I'm trying to present, I think the service sector is less likely to be automated than the manufacturing sector. And I think this is really the key in this framework, is when you think about large industries or you have an increasingly industrialized economy, it's technologically more likely to happen when you have large manufacturing sectors. You can replace workers who do these jobs with machines. But when you get to a service-oriented economy, it's not the intensity with which you can use technology is not the same. So I think that's how I would look at it. And of course, to the extent that you can replace a lot of workers as you deindustrialize, you become a lot more efficient. And the other point I would make in this is that we should not necessarily think of deindustrialization as a negative process. In fact, what you see is actually a good thing, because what's happening is that the sector is becoming more and more productive, so that you need fewer and fewer workers to do the same thing, or fewer workers are doing even better than what a large number of people used to do before. So when employment is shifting across sectors, it's a sign of progress, because you don't need as many workers in the factories because of automation. But it does have implications for inequality, though, because you have a lot more people in the service sector. And as I mentioned in my presentation, in the service sector, you have a range of things that people will do. You have CEOs who are making millions, just as you have people at the very low end of the skill level who are doing odd jobs and are getting paid very low wages. So you have a lot of heterogeneity in the service sector of most modern economies. And I'm not convinced, actually, that you can replace all these workers by machines. It's very difficult. You still need people to do these low-end jobs, just as you need people to do the high-end jobs. So it's less likely that automation will affect countries that tend to be much more service-oriented than it is in the case of a country that is much more industrialized.
Yes, in the front, Dr. Pittman.
Thank you. Russell Pittman from the Antitrust Division at Justice Department. I would take issue with the optimism you're suggesting regarding manufacturing productivity, because one of the things we learned a lot about yesterday is that some of the job shedding in the manufacturing sector has to do with the rigidities in the labor market, and particularly the fact that more experienced people get laid off when they reach a certain age, and they end up in exactly what you talked about, the bottom end of the service sector, running chicken shops or something. So I think increasing the productivity of the services sector may be in part not a direct policy, but maybe a side benefit of making the labor market in manufacturing work better, and keeping some of those people in the higher productivity jobs, maybe not getting the higher wages they were making when they were 40, when they're 60. One other broader point I'd like to make, if I could. When you put up your chart with the turning points you mentioned, you said, well, you know, if we went back to the halfway point here, we'd say the Kuznets curve, in fact, we observe. What's interesting is that Joseph Stiglitz did that in the mid-90s, and he rather strongly believed that what he called the East Asian miracle economies, very much including South Korea, did not exhibit the Kuznets curve. He said he observed what was happening in these miracle economies, as he called them, and he said, look, countries like South Korea have been able to avoid increasing inequality with income growth because they have immediately plowed money back into land reforms and education. And I wonder if you've seen his results, and if you have any idea why you and he, at least at that point, seem to have opposite conclusions from what one assumed is the same data. Thank you.
His paper, I will certainly have a look at it.
1996.
1996. I'll take a look at it, but at least for me, looking at the data, I clearly see it in the data that we have. Maybe he was using different numbers, or maybe the time period was different, because you can think of a situation where if you were backtracking enough, you would not have picked up a significant part of declining, or maybe you would not have picked up a significant part of depending on the time period that you use, you can have very different, a very different perspective on it. I think now that we have the benefit of many years of data, we can probably see it more. And he probably was not using the same measures, but I've come across, for example, papers by the bank. Nancy Birdsall had written one with a few other co-authors in the 1990s, and they clearly showed that inequality had declined in South Korea for much of the 80s and 90s. So growth went hand in hand with decline.
I think his point is that inequality didn't increase at the beginning.
Yeah.
With the initial increase in income.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to look at the paper. Yeah.
One of the things we were talking about back and forth as we're working on the paper was just kind of this manufacturing aspect, and so we're talking about the productivity of the manufacturing sector, and then how that really plays into this aspect of income inequality, and how in some ways Korea keeps trying to keep the manufacturing sector productive. Is there a way you see this kind of continuing to try to maintain that productivity to try and slow down the rate of income inequality?
Let me see. Well, if you look, actually, it's very interesting when you think about the South Korean case, because there's not necessarily a puzzle, but I think even though there's a lot of shifts in employment from manufacturing to the service sector, and I think this goes back to the point that you were making as well. If you look at manufacturing value added in the South Korean case, it's actually going up. It's gone up. It's not declining. Whereas in other cases, when you look at employment shares and the manufacturing value added, they tend to go the same way in most countries. In South Korea, it's the other way around. So even though the country is becoming more and more service oriented, manufacturing is still very strong. So it is a very strong sector. But I think even as the manufacturing sector keeps up with the evolution of the Korean economy, it's still not enough, in my view, to prevent the increase in income inequality, because the service sector is simply becoming too large. To me, that's the core of the argument, if you believe what I'm saying, is that no matter how hard you try to maintain a very strong manufacturing sector, albeit that sector becoming much more productive and requiring fewer and fewer workers, you cannot escape the fact that income inequality is going to increase. It's just, if you believe the story that I'm telling you, that's essentially what it is. That even if you try to push manufacturing as hard as you can, it's going to be very difficult for you to manage the structural pressure, because as that sector becomes more productive, people become idle, so they have to move somewhere else. They're not going to go back to agriculture, so they have to move up to the service sector. And when they move to the service sector, it's all open, because there you have a range of things that people can do. Now, is this very different from Canada, for example? No, it's not very different. And this is why I think this is very important, because is it very different from the US? Not really. It's the same thing. The US, Canada, many OECD countries have gone through that same process of deindustrialization. Canada, the province where I work in Ontario, is a classic example of this, because until the financial crisis, Ontario was largely dependent on the manufacturing sector, in particular the auto sector. But once the crisis hits, many of these car plants close down. All of a sudden, these guaranteed incomes, heavily unionized work in the auto sector disappear. So once these people lose their jobs, where do they go? It could be the 50-year-olds who have now to go and work in the service sector, or people just become idle, they pick up odd jobs here and there, and it enlarges the distribution of income. And that's basically what we've seen in Ontario, in Canada, in the US, and now we're seeing it in South Korea. So that's why I believe the South Korean case is interesting, because you're seeing the same kind of thing that's happened here in the US or in Canada, and it's just a natural process. And now the real question, I guess, for policymakers is how do you deal with it? Because some people may say, well, we can tolerate a Gini coefficient of 0.32, 3.5, 0.35 or whatever, right? Because at the end of the day, income inequality, there's no such thing as an optimal amount that we can tolerate. And this is where the political debate will be, which is, can you accept that you will have a society where you have, highly unequal income, or are you going to accept something around 0.4, 0.5? And this is really the policy part of it. But on that note, I would argue that we have every reason to focus on inequality because there's enough evidence. And I make this fairly clear at the beginning of a paper that inequality matters. So there's studies, for instance, that have looked at growth spells in various economies, and they clearly show that when you have a relatively more equal distribution of income, you can grow longer over a sustained period of time. So you have longer growth spells. Or there's studies that show that inequality of income has implications for inequality of outcomes like education, health. It has implications for mobility of people across society. And at the basic level, individuals care about their relative standing in society. I think it's naive to assume that we care only about our own wealth and not the wealth of our neighbor. Branko Milanovic, who does a lot of interesting work on income inequality at the World Bank, always gives this example. He says, if you put people around a table and you give one person $20,000 and everybody else 25 cents, right? Even though all of them are better off, everybody else who gets everyone who receives 25 cents will feel worse off. And that's how it is, because you're always comparing yourself to how people do and not how you do. So other people's incomes enter into your utility function, if you want to think about it in a sort of mathematical way. So I believe it's naive to assume that income inequality is something that we can just accept. Now, I know policy-wise it becomes a problem because you always get into this never-ending debate. Do we focus on growth or do we focus on inequality? And most people on the right will tell you, no, it's growth that really matters and not inequality. But I don't think, and I find this, my personal view is that this debate is completely, it's useless because it's something that you have to deal with.
Yeah, Dr. Quinn again.
One other comment on this very good point you made about deindustrialization and about how, at some point when countries grow, they start to deindustrialize. There's a book on the Korean economy, I don't know if you've seen it, by Barry Eichengreen and Perkins and Shin. And one of the things they do is compare Korea's economic development with other middle income or countries that have made the transition or middle income countries. And they say, yeah, if you look at the data, Korea is deindustrializing just like everybody else does, but with three differences from the rest of the world. A, they industrialized much more quickly. They've really gone over a line much more quickly than most other countries do. B, in the services sector, they have much lower productivity than most countries do that focus on services. And C, probably not accidentally, they have been much less successful at exporting services like banking and insurance and so forth than other countries are. So I wonder if that also might be a factor here not directly in the inequality debate, but certainly indirectly in that South Korea's services sector seems to be different from some of the other services and in many ways less successful than some of the other countries' services sectors.
Certainly. In fact, I mention it in the conclusion. In the conclusion of the paper, I do talk about it, but one thing I don't do, and it's something that probably I should look into, is that I don't compare how the service sector performs across countries with fairly similar levels of income. But I agree. I mean, it's clear that the service sector in South Korea is not as productive as the manufacturing sector, and that's been established by the book that you mentioned, and there's another paper that I cite in in this current paper, it's a working paper from the Peterson Institute that also talks about this. So I agree with you, and maybe one of the things that other future researchers would do, who should be looking at, is really how does the service sector compare. And I also don't look at the export side of it. Maybe that's something that would be worth investigating. But I have seen that book. I have read parts of it. Yeah.
So another thing besides FDI that's important for Korea is trade. And so can you talk a little bit about kind of where you saw trade or how you tried to factor in trade and what you think might be going on there?
So the trade stories would seem to fit the experience of South Korea for a lot of it, because when income inequality is declining in South Korea, this is the textbook trade story. So there's this famous theorem, the Stolper-Samuelson theorem in trade economics, which says that when you export goods that use your abundant factor intensively, that country's abundant factor gains and the scarce factor is losing. So if you think about the beginning of industrialization in South Korea, when we were exporting a lot of goods that use labor intensively, which was the abundant factor, labor gained as a result of this. So you see a decline in inequality in South Korea for a long time. And, again, if you were to write that paper 10 years ago, you would have said, yeah, this is the standard story. Trade works in that sense because northern countries see income inequality increase, such as in the US, whereas South Korea, to the extent that labor was still the abundant factor, would see the flip side of that. But now it's reversed. So you can no longer use that trade story to make a case for inequality increasing. And I think part of the way to adjust this would be to say, well, maybe now South Korea is no longer labor abundant, but it's more capital abundant. So that now the whole thing is shifting. So I'm not too. I don't have very strong opinions about whether trade contributes to that equation as much. All I can tell from my estimation is that it doesn't, because precisely maybe these effects over time. Because in one period it was going one way and in the other it went the other way. They are canceling each other out. But what I would point out in the estimates that we do is that although trade is included in some of the estimations, it doesn't affect the main hypothesis of a paper. Where I think trade works, and you can't see it from the estimation, is that to the extent that trade leads to deindustrialization, right? So you can imagine a case where, and that's the South Korean case, or any other hypothetical economy, you open yourself to trade and investment, you liberalize. Over time, what happens is because you're competing more and more with other low-cost producers, some of your industries have to go. So we've seen that in the US, we've seen that in Canada and many other rich countries. So in that sense, globalization is actually, globalization or trade or FDI, either one of these two, right? They are feeding into that process of deindustrialization. So I think that's where you see that's where that link comes in. So the framework that I propose in the paper can still help us make sense of the trade aspect of it, because trade clearly plays a part in that industrialization and deindustrialization process. I mean, you can think of, there are many cases like this where countries now and even now middle-income countries who are counting a lot on trade are now losing to other lower income countries as production is relocated. I mean, it keeps shifting, right? So if you think about the garment sector, which at one point used to be very strong in northern countries, in rich countries, it's moved to East Asia, and then now it's moved more and more to countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so on. So it keeps moving. Why? Because you're more open to the rest of the world, and you have to compete based on lower costs. Now, some countries, and I think you had sent me a document about this, where we're talking about hiring foreign workers now in many other countries, including in South Korea. And part of the reason why we do this now is because we can hire them at a lower cost. And rather than risk losing these industries to other countries, we would bring in workers in order to do the same job that our own citizens don't want to do. So we have temporary workers program in Canada. all kinds of programs for what we call circular migration, but other countries in the developing world are also doing the same thing because they're bringing workers from even poorer countries at even lower cost in order to be able to keep the manufacturing sector alive. And if they don't do that, then the other option is to just shift it abroad completely, so you lose it. So these are interesting things to think of when you think about the manufacturing sector, that it's a very dynamic sector and that you're constantly now being faced with globalization. You have to compete. You can try to mitigate by putting even more technology in your production process, but at some point you run out of ideas, and the only way for you to keep that is to actually just ship it elsewhere so it moves. So I think, to go back to your question, that trade does play a part in this equation. It's just that in the estimation that I do, I can't really see it empirically, but I know it feeds into the structural characteristics of economy, certainly.
Yes, Troy, in the back.
Troy Saron with the Korea Economic Institute. Thank you, Dr. Samy, for a very interesting presentation. I guess I'd like to try to tie together some of the comments that have been here in the discussion, and sort of, I think intellectually, I agree with your presentation and everything, but I just wonder if in the South Korean case, if perhaps maybe there's structural factors in the economy that are showing the changes, I guess, earlier than I would expect. And what I mean by that is that if you look at South Korea, as you noted, manufacturing is essentially plateaued. So it's slightly below where it was maybe in the mid-90s, but it's not necessarily significantly far below. At the same time, there's other changes taking place in the economy. If I remember correctly, I think it was under the Nomu-Yun administration, you had sort of the formalization of basically a dual labor market, so informal workers, and they receive lower wages. So you have this new stratification, which creates inequality. You also, Korea, at the same time, is going through, it's in the rapid aging process. So more of these workers who are being forced out sort of in their mid-50s into lower paying service jobs, or essentially creating their own food truck stands. Or they're losing their high wage job, and it's happening at a more rapid rate because the population is aging. So the people who came up with the economy are now getting pushed out, essentially. At the same time, a lot of this contributes to, if you look at some of the OECD numbers, Korea has, it's either the highest or the second highest level of old age poverty in the OECD. So I guess when you sort of pull all these factors together, that you have new workers coming in, but many of them are at lower wages than their predecessors were. And you have the sort of, we'll say, premium workers who maybe were helping to contribute to equality, who were originally in the manufacturing sector, now retiring and going into these very low wage jobs. And you have matched that with, as we were talking about, Icon Green service sector that is significantly underperforming. And, it is, in terms of productivity, about the second worst in the OECD. That all of this combines together to take, and you've now eliminated this period where you had a reduction in inequality, and now you're seeing it spike because of, I guess, maybe four factors. Those three factors, and that over time, especially since the government's goal is to take and sort of boost the service sector and create more service jobs, that you have these structural factors tied with the projected long-run future, that it's pushing the inequality up both rapidly now, and it will continue so in the future as the transition you talk about takes place.
Disagree with a dualistic labor story. I think the market reforms that were done in the South Korean case clearly created that divergence between, on the one hand, people who have fairly secure jobs with standard contracts versus people who have unsecured positions, part-time, etc. But I think that's partly reflected in the service sector story that I'm trying to tell. On the demographics, we actually controlled for it in some of the estimations, although the results are not in the paper. I don't remember if they showed up as significant, but I know they didn't change what we were proposing. I started this paper by mentioning that there are many explanations out there for what people think drives income inequality, and you can add as many variables as you can in the model. At some point you have to stop because you run out of data, so you can't do it. So you cannot include everything, but the ones that tend to be
the most commonly mentioned, I certainly looked into them and included them, but they didn't change the story I was trying to tell. Doesn't mean they are not important. I think we know, and we've talked about this, that the South Korean economy faces a lot of demographic challenges. Population is going to decline by 2050, from what I've been told. Fertility rates are going down. People are living longer. But it's, again, the same story in rich countries. So that's why I'm convinced that this is actually not very different from what we're seeing. There may be differences here and there, but the story is pretty much the story of a country such as Canada or the US that has gone through these transitions and now is facing the same problems. So how do you deal with it? You do what we've tried in Canada. You extend the retirement age, for instance. Or now we're talking more and more about contributing more to pensions, because we know that pensions will not be sustainable in the future. So these things will happen, and it's something that policymakers will have to deal with. So I don't necessarily disagree with you about the fact that maybe dualistic labor markets play a role, demographics play a role, but I think it's still, a lot of this can be tied back to the structure of the economy. So when, for example, you talk about dual labor markets, you're more likely to see that, I think, in the South Korean case, in the service sector. So that would tell the story. Or maybe you will see it even in the manufacturing sector, but even if it does, then it would explain the sort of changes in inequality that is happening. I hope this answers your question. Yeah.
So, I mean, for you, looking at Brazil and Korea now, are there ways you think these countries should try to go about managing it? I mean, looking at manage this income inequality, or is it really trying to say how much can we, is part of the management saying, okay, what's our Gini coefficient that we can deal with? What's our gap that we can deal with, and still sustain that growth over time that we're looking for in the 21st century economy?
Well, I mean, if you look at the South Korean case, it doesn't, except for the last few years, and the last few years you have to factor in the global financial crisis, obviously. But growth doesn't seem to have slowed that much, right, in the South Korean case. I mean, you're looking at 6% growth over the long term, or even more. So even though inequality is increasing slightly, it doesn't seem to have had a negative impact on growth. Now, this may sound strange to you, but I don't like to speculate about the future. So I'm not sure that, I'm not going to say anything about whether I think inequality will affect growth in the future, but if you base it on existing work, and if it goes to a very high level, you can certainly see that scenario unfolding, but I don't think it's as crucial now. But at the end of the day, I think, that decision in terms of how you deal with inequality is really a policy decision. I mean, you have to decide how you can deal with it, and you can look at redistribution policy. But of course, if you look at redistribution policy, that means you have to think more about taxation. You need to tax better. The Brazilian case is interesting. I mentioned it before because, and it's not only in Brazil, it's the whole Latin America. They've done a lot of redistribution through cash transfers, etc. But keep in mind that Latin American countries, you're looking at very high levels, so 0.5 Gini and above. And even with redistribution, we are still among the highest. So for them, it was really getting to that point, but it wasn't simply not sustainable. I don't think we are at that point yet in the South Korean case. But having said that, I mean, you look at the news, and I mentioned it. You look at the news, the comments from policymakers and so on. It seems that it is a problem because people are talking a lot about the shrinking of the middle class in South Korea. So clearly, there is an issue there that will have to be dealt with. How you go about it is, it's something that really ultimately comes down to the policymakers in terms of whether they think it's a problem or not. But the evidence seems to point that when you have very high levels of inequality, it's not good for society. It creates political instability. It creates all kinds of issues, and then the middle class has an important role to play in most economies. They are the people who are investing in human capital. They are the people who are supposed to create jobs, to create wealth for the future. They tend to be the ones who save the most, usually. So there's a lot of reason to focus on the middle class, I think. But again, this is an issue that people, depending on where they are, will deal with very, very differently. But it's here, it's present in the debate. I mean, we have the same debate here in the US and in Canada. And I think in the US and Canada, I think the question really has been more about the top 1%, which is what people have been looking into a lot. I actually have a graph at the end in the appendix, and if you look at the South Korean case, it's not that extreme. If you look at the top 1% market income in South Korea, it's not actually as high as countries such as the US, Canada, or Germany. So it's certainly not as extreme, which is why I go back to what I said during my presentation. I find this issue in South Korea to be really intriguing because if you look at the numbers, they don't seem to be as extreme. And yet people are already starting to talk about it, right? And I think it's because they were used to, for a long time, people were used to very low levels of inequality. And now that it's slowly going up, people are starting to worry about it. But if you compare across countries, you'll see that it's not as bad compared to, let's say, Brazil or most Latin American countries.
So if it's not as bad, is there a way when you're managing it, because you talked about in the paper, sometimes part of income inequality is a perception of inequality of access to different things, education, healthcare, stuff like that. So if the possibility is that it's not as bad, could you go after some areas where you think there was inequality of access and try to alleviate that perception, and then possibly you still have your income inequality, but at least the perception of the income inequality, perception of income access, inequality of access is gone, or is alleviated to some extent?
I haven't really looked at this issue in terms of whether people in South Korea, whether inequality of income is actually translating or is resulting from inequality of access to opportunities and so on. Certainly it's something that people, but what I would say though is that I certainly don't want people to think that inequality and growth are mutually incompatible. I mean, you can have policy that reduce inequality without hurting growth, right? And I think very often in the literature, people tend to miss that point because the moment you say income inequality, people have this perception that somehow if you deal with inequality, you're bound to suffer from a growth sense. But it's not clear to me that this is the case. And I go back to cash transfers, for instance, in Latin America, where now parents are being given money in order to encourage their children to attend school. These are not going against growth because you're preparing for the future. So you are dealing with a problem of inequality by sending children to school, which will help build human capital and growth in the future. So these things are not necessarily mutually incompatible. So there's no necessary trade-off always between growth and inequality, as some people would tend to think. Of course, no one will, you can't just focus on redistribution. I mean, you have to enlarge the pie, and everybody knows that you need to have growth in order to redistribute. Otherwise, you run out of ways in terms of which you can slice the same size of a pie. So you need to grow it, but redistribution is a bit more complicated because then you need to look at, okay, where are these issues? But again, if you go back to what we essentially are arguing in this paper, what we're saying is that managing these structural pressures may act, and in the Brazilian case, that's one of the arguments that we propose, is that even though there's been a lot of evidence that people have put forward that it's redistribution that's causing this decline in income inequality, our argument is that part of the explanation has to do with the structural factor itself, not redistribution. So the fact that Brazil and many of the Latin American countries are going through deindustrialization is what really is driving this. Redistribution plays a part in it, but our view is that this part has been overstated. So again, so if I use that logic, what I'm essentially saying here is that income inequality is increasing here because of the structural characteristics. And the way to deal with it then is to figure out what kind of policy you want to adopt to redistribute. Now, I don't know if any of you have any thoughts about this. I mean, I certainly haven't looked at whether there's unequal access to education and health and other outcomes in the South Korean case. I'm not sure this is the case, but certainly in Latin American countries and other contexts, you've seen it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think this has been a great discussion about a very interesting topic and something that I hope we can continue talking about more. So please join me thanking Dr. Samy for his presentation.